The grave was empty. Valerius stood before the shallow depression in the frozen earth, the wind tearing at the edges of his fur-lined cloak. A simple wooden marker, already leaning, bore the name Siv of Greywood. Died in the 3rd month of the thaw. A wasting sickness, the official reports had claimed. A tragedy for a noble house already in decline. His wolves, however, had told a different story. They had scented not decay, but life. A trail, faint as a memory, leading away from this sad, false patch of ground and into the whispering gloom of the dire wood. He had followed it alone. His guard, his title, his crown of sorrows. He had left them all at the edge of the trees. Here he was only an alpha, following a scent that defied reason. The trail led him for miles, through tangled briar and over slick, moss-covered stones, to a place the world had forgotten. A small cottage, built into the lee of a granite cliff, a curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney like a whispered secret. The scent was stronger here. Life. And something else. Sickness. Not the wasting sickness of the reports, but the sharp, metallic tang of a wound fighting to fester. He moved with a predator's silence, his feet making no sound on the damp earth. Through a grimy pane of glass, he saw her. Siv of Greywood. Not wasted, not dead. Her hair, the color of autumn ferns, was tied back in a messy knot. Her face was thinner than he remembered from the courtly gatherings of his youth. Her fine woolen gowns replaced by practical, mended homespun. But it was her. And she was not alone. She knelt on the hearth, her back to the window, murmuring soft words to the creature lying on a bed of old blankets. It was one of his. A great, black-furred timber wolf from the northern packs, its flank laid open in a grievous wound. A poacher's trap by the look of it. The beast should have been dead. Or it should have been raging, delirious with pain. Instead, it was still, its massive head resting near her knee as she cleaned the injury with a gentle, practiced hand. Valerius felt a low growl build in his own chest, a territorial imperative he had not felt in years. This was impossible. A wolfless woman, a cast-off from a minor house, calming a dying alpha wolf with nothing but her presence? The stories about her, the ones her family had tried so desperately to suppress, came back to him. The whispers of a curse, that animals on the brink of death sought her out, that she was a harbinger of doom, a soul stealer. He watched as she finished her work, her movements economical and sure. She dipped a cloth in a bowl of steaming water, the scent of herbs, yarrow and willow bark, faintly reaching him. The wolf's breathing was a ragged whisper, but its eyes, chips of gold in the firelight, followed her every move with a kind of exhausted reverence. She was not stealing its soul. She was easing its passage, or, impossibly, holding it here. He had seen enough. He moved to the door, a simple plank affair, and knocked. Once. A solid, definitive sound that cracked the quiet of the woods. Inside, everything went still. He heard a sharp intake of breath, the soft scrape of a stool being pushed back. The door opened a fraction, and one gray eye, wide with alarm, peered out. "Who's there?" Her voice was a low tremor, the voice of a woman long used to being alone. He did not answer. He simply pushed the door open, stepping over the threshold. He was a large man, and he filled the small doorway, blocking out the dying light. He let his cloak fall back, revealing the silver clasp of the royal house on his leather jerkin. He saw the moment recognition dawned, the way the blood drained from her face, leaving it stark and pale. Her eyes darted past him, to the woods, to the window, counting exits that did not exist. "Lady Siv," he said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the small room, heavy as iron. Your grave is empty." Her hand, still holding the damp cloth, trembled. She did not deny it. She did not scream or weep. Her chin lifted a fraction, a gesture of defiance so small he might have missed it if he were not watching so closely. It served its purpose. It did, he agreed, his gaze flicking to the wounded wolf, who had lifted its head and was now emitting a low, pained rumble. It brought me to you. He looked back at her, at the woman who had faked her own death to escape a world that had no place for her, a world he ruled. The mating auction is in 2 months. Your cousin was quite distressed to lose such a valuable commodity. Her face hardened. I am not a broodmare to be sold for a title. No, he said, his voice dropping even lower, softer. You are not. The air crackled with the unspoken, the truth of why she had run, the truth of why he had come. He was a king without a queen, an alpha without a mate. His pack was restless, his line unsecured, and every unmated noblewoman of age was a potential solution. A political contract. She had chosen a false death over a real cage. He took a step closer. The wounded wolf on the hearth snarled, a weak, desperate sound. Siv put a hand out, not looking at the animal, her eyes locked on his. Stay back. Valerius stopped. He held her gaze, a long, silent assessment. He saw not a curse, but a strange and quiet power, a stillness that soothed the dying, a courage that chose exile over gilded chains. The poachers who did this, he said, nodding toward the wolf, are my men's concern. But you are mine. He did not say it as a threat. He said it as a fact, a terrible, immutable truth that had just taken root in the center of this forgotten cottage. You will come with me. The journey to Stonefall was a study in silence. Siv sat opposite him in the enclosed carriage, a thick fur blanket tucked around her that she hadn't asked for. He had simply placed it on the seat beside her before they left, a silent offering. She had left her cottage with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small, hastily wrapped bundle of herbs. Bracken, the wolf she had named in the privacy of her own mind, had been carried out by 2 of Valerius's men, his transport a litter made of their own cloaks. He was being taken to the fortress kennels, to the royal vets. She knew, with a certainty that ached, that she would never see him again. Valerius did not speak. He watched the passing landscape, the dense green of the direwood giving way to the stark, windswept hills of the north. His profile was like something carved from the granite of the mountains themselves, unyielding, severe. He had not told her why he was taking her, what he intended. Prisoner? Guest? Future bride? The uncertainty was a cold knot in her stomach. She was no longer dead, but she was no longer free. She focused on the details, a habit learned in a childhood of watching for her cousin's moods. The carriage was old but impeccably maintained, the leather of the seats worn soft, the air smelling faintly of cedar and his own scent, like cold air and winter frost. He did not fidget. He did not shift his weight. He simply existed, a solid, unmovable presence in the small space. It should have been terrifying. It was. But it was also steady. For the first time since she had clawed her way out of her own shallow grave, she was not alone with her fear. As dusk bled across the sky in shades of bruised purple and gray, the carriage rumbled to a halt. The door was opened not by a guard, but by a small, pale face crowned with a mop of unruly black hair. A boy, no older than 6, peered inside, his eyes enormous in the twilight. "Father?" The voice was small but clear. Valerius's entire posture shifted. The Iron King dissolved, and for a fleeting second, he was just a man looking at his son. "Pip," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier severity. "You should be in bed." "Hjorda said you were coming," the boy announced, ignoring the mild admonishment. His gaze slid past Valerius and landed on Siv. He stared, his head tilted. "Who is she?" "This is Lady Siv," Valerius said. He did not command her to acknowledge the boy. He simply made the introduction and waited. Siv looked at the child. He was small for his age, with a fragile look about him, his skin almost translucent. There were faint bluish shadows under his eyes. She felt a familiar pull, the same quiet resonance she felt with wounded things. "Hello, Pip," she said softly. Pip continued to stare. "Your hair is the color of a muddy carrot," he declared, with the unfiltered honesty of the very young. A muscle twitched in Valerius's jaw, but he said nothing. Siv found a small smile, the first real one in what felt like a lifetime. "And your hair is the color of a raven's wing," she replied. The boy seemed to consider this a fair exchange. He scrambled up into the carriage, ignoring his father completely, and planted himself on the seat next to Siv. He looked her up and down with unnerving focus. "Are you a ghost? Hjorda said you were a ghost from a grave." "Pip," Valerius's voice was a low warning. "I'm not a ghost," Siv answered, her voice even. "I was just resting." Pip seemed to accept this. He leaned his small body against her side, a startlingly intimate gesture. He was shivering, a fine tremor that ran through his little frame. His skin was cool to the touch. He wasn't just a fragile-looking child. He was unwell. "You're cold," she murmured, her hand instinctively coming up to touch his forehead. He was clammy but not feverish. It was a deeper chill, a sickness in the bone. Valerius watched the interaction, his face an unreadable mask. He saw the way his son, who flinched from the touch of healers and shied away from the ladies of the court, leaned into this strange woman's side as if he belonged there. He saw the way her hand rested on his son's head, a gesture of instinctual comfort. "He has the wasting," Valerius said, the words flat, devoid of emotion. It was the same lie told on her grave marker, but hearing it applied to this small child, it was no longer a political convenience. It was a death sentence. "The healers can do nothing. It took his mother. Now it takes him." Siv's breath caught. She looked from the king's shuttered face to the boy, who was now resting his head on her lap, his eyes drifting closed. The terrible, cursed gift inside her stirred. It did not just call to the dying. It called to the broken, to the pieces of a life that had been shattered. The king's grief was a palpable thing in the carriage, a cold so profound it felt like the heart of winter. And his son was fading in that cold. She looked up at Valerius, her own fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by a fierce, protective surge that stunned her. "There is no such thing as the wasting," she said, her voice low and clear. "There is only grief deep enough to kill." He did not flinch. He did not argue. He simply held her gaze, and in the depths of his eyes, she saw the briefest flicker of something that looked like hope. A terrible, dangerous thing. The carriage lurched forward again, climbing the final rise to the fortress of Stonefall, carrying a dead woman, a grieving king, and a dying child into the heart of the night. Stonefall was not a castle. It was a wound in the side of a mountain. A fortress of gray granite and black iron, its towers clawing at a perpetually overcast sky. It was a place built to endure, not to comfort. As Siv stepped out of the carriage, the wind hit her, sharp and smelling of snow. The great gates had opened to admit them, and now loomed a courtyard filled with men-at-arms, their faces hard and suspicious as they stared at the woman their king had brought back from the dead. A man even larger than Valerius stepped forward, his face a road map of old scars, a thick gray braid hanging over his shoulder. "My lord," he said, his voice a low rumble. He glanced at Siv, his eyes lingering for a moment, dismissive and cold. "The kennels are prepared. The beast is sedated." "Good, Bastion," Valerius said. "See to it personally." He then turned his attention to the small, warm weight in Siv's arms. Pip had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep, his head tucked into the curve of her neck. Valerius made a move to take him, his hands hovering in the space between them. He waited. It was the strangest thing. A king, an alpha of alphas, waiting for permission. Siv met his eyes over his son's dark hair. She could have held on, asserted some newfound fragile claim. Instead, she carefully transferred the sleeping boy into his father's arms. The exchange was brief, their fingers brushing for a scant second. His skin was cold, hers warm. The contrast was a small shock, a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with fear. "Hjordis," Valerius called, his voice echoing slightly in the vast courtyard. An older woman bustled forward, wrapped in practical wools, her face lined with worry. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, flicked from the king to the sleeping child, and finally to Siv. There was a flicker of recognition, and something else. Pity. Or perhaps respect. Hjordis was the keeper of the royal household, but she was from the old territories, a woman who knew the stories that were not written in books. She was the one who had told Pip about the ghost from the grave. "Take Lady Siv to the Queen's wing," Valerius commanded, his voice once again resonating with royal authority. "See that she has everything she needs." A murmur went through the assembled guards. The Queen's wing. It had been sealed for 6 years, since the death of Valerius's mate, Alina. To place this strange woman there was not just a provision of lodging, it was a statement. Hjordis bowed her head. "This way, my lady." Siv followed the older woman through a labyrinth of cold stone corridors, the silence broken only by the whisper of their footsteps. The air grew stiller, dustier, as they entered a sealed-off part of the fortress. Hjordis produced a heavy iron key and unlocked a set of massive carved wooden doors. They swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges. The rooms within were preserved under a film of dust and time. A sitting room with furniture shrouded in white cloths, a vast bedchamber with a hearth cold as a tomb. It was a shrine to a dead woman, a monument to a king's grief, and she was to be housed in the middle of it. A gilded cage, just as she'd feared. "The king commanded it," Hjordis said, as if sensing Siv's unease. She walked over to a heavy brocade curtain and pulled it back, revealing a window that overlooked the sheer drop of the mountainside. "He has not allowed another living soul to sleep in these rooms since she passed." "Why me?" Siv asked, her voice barely a whisper. Hjordis turned, her expression unreadable. "Because his son, who has not slept a full night in a year, fell asleep in your arms. Because the alpha wolf from the north, who killed 2 of his own pack in a pain frenzy, lay at your feet like a pup. You are either the deadliest curse to walk the Northlands, child, or you are the only cure he has left." She gestured to a smaller adjoining door. "A bath has been drawn. There are clothes in the wardrobe. They belong to her. The king's orders." After the woman left, Siv stood alone in the suffocating silence. To wear a dead queen's clothes, to sleep in her bed, it was a violation, a claiming. She walked to the wardrobe and opened it. The scent of dried lavender and another woman's life wafted out. Gowns of silk and velvet in shades of winter blue and silver. Nothing like her practical homespun. She closed the doors, a feeling of revulsion rising in her. She bathed in the hot water, scrubbing away the grime of her journey and the scent of her old life. She emerged, wrapped in a thick towel, to find a simple woolen nightdress laid out on the bed, one that had clearly not come from the dead queen's wardrobe. It was plain, new, and warm. Yordis, then, had a mind of her own. Later, curled in the center of the massive, cold bed, sleep would not come. The fortress was too quiet, the darkness too heavy. She heard the faint sound of a door creaking open. She sat bolt upright, her heart pounding. Pip stood in the doorway, a small silhouette against the hall light. He was holding a little carved wooden bird, its wings worn smooth. "I can't sleep," he whispered. "The shadows are making faces." Siv's fear dissolved. She held back the covers. "Come here, then." He padded across the cold floor and climbed into the bed, burrowing under the furs beside her. He was still cold, his small body radiating a deep, unhealthy chill. "Tell me a story," he commanded, his voice muffled by the blankets. "I don't know any stories," she said, which was true. Her life had not been one for stories. "Tell me about the wolf," he said. And so, in the dead queen's bed, in the heart of the grieving king's fortress, Siv found herself telling a small, sick boy about a cottage in the woods, about gathering herbs, about the quiet trust of a wounded animal. Pip did not interrupt. He just listened, his breathing slowly evening out. As she spoke, the chill emanating from his body seemed to lessen, replaced by a fragile warmth. He fell asleep with his small hand clutching a fold of her nightdress, the wooden bird nestled between them. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the sound of his breathing, a small, steady anchor in the vast, lonely dark. She was a prisoner, yes, but for the first time, she felt she was in a cage that held two people, not just one. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Siv did not leave the queen's wing. No one forbade her, but the fortress beyond her doors felt like a hostile country she had no papers to enter. Yordis brought her meals, her face a mask of professional neutrality. But the clothes that appeared were always simple and practical, not the silks of the previous queen. A small, silent rebellion on her behalf. Pip was her constant companion. He would appear at her door in the morning and stay until Yordis came to collect him for his lessons. He was a creature of quiet, intense observation. He would watch her for long stretches, as if trying to solve a puzzle. He asked questions that were both childish and deeply perceptive. "Did my mother have hair like a muddy carrot, too?" he asked one afternoon, as Siv was attempting to brush the tangles from her own long locks. Siv's hand stilled. "I don't know, Pip. I never met her." "Her hair was the color of summer honey," a low voice said from the doorway. Siv's head snapped up. Valerius stood there, leaning against the doorframe. He never entered without this silent pause, this offering of retreat. He was dressed not as a king, but in simple leather breeches and a tunic, and he looked tired. The shadows under his eyes were as deep as his son's. "Father!" Pip scrambled off the window seat and ran to him. Valerius swung him up into his arms, a gesture of practiced ease. The love between them was a fierce, quiet thing, the one source of warmth in the cold fortress. "Bastian tells me you have not left these rooms," Valerius said, his eyes on Civ. It was a statement, not a question. "There seemed no reason to," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. "There is a library," he said, "and a garden under glass. It is sheltered." He was offering her a larger cage. He looked at the brush still in her hand, at the thick, unruly mass of her hair. "Yordis can send a maid to help you with that." "I'm used to managing on my own," she said, a little too sharply. She hated the implication that she was some pampered lady who couldn't braid her own hair. He did not take offense. He simply nodded, accepting her answer. "Pip has not had a nightmare since you arrived," he stated, his gaze unblinking. "The healers report his chill has lessened." Civ said nothing. She did not know what to say. Her gift, her curse, had no name. It had no rules. She just settled things, soothed the frayed edges of life, whether in a wolf or a boy. How could she explain that to a king? "I was sent to the mating auction because my father's lands are poor, and my cousin Gisela wanted my dowry to add to her own," she said instead, the words tumbling out, a sudden need to fill the silence with a truth he could understand. "They said I was barren, cursed. They said I drove my own mother to an early grave with my strangeness. It was more profitable to sell me off for a political alliance than to keep me." She hadn't meant to say all that. The confession left her feeling raw and exposed. Valerius listened, his expression unchanging. He gently set Pip down, and the boy immediately ran back to Civ's side, taking her hand. Valerius's eyes followed the movement. "Gisela of Stonecrest is your father's niece," he said. "She is a guest at my court twice a year. She speaks very fondly of her poor, lost cousin." Civ's stomach turned to ice. "She is a viper." "I am aware," Valerius said, and the quiet finality in his tone was more chilling than any shout. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she felt like he was seeing every patched-together piece of her soul, the fear, the loneliness, the stubborn refusal to break. "No one will sell you here, Civ." He turned and left, his footsteps receding down the stone corridor. The promise hung in the air, heavy and absolute. He hadn't said she was free. He had said she would not be sold. A subtle but critical distinction. She was no longer a commodity. She was now his possession. She looked down at Pip, who was tracing the lines on her palm with his small finger. She was not sure which fate was more terrifying. Later that evening, long after Pip had been taken to his own bed, there was a soft knock on her door. Civ opened it to find Valerius standing there, holding a book. It was bound in dark, worn leather. "From the library," he said, holding it out to her. He did not try to cross the threshold. He just offered it. She took it. The leather was smooth under her fingers. The Herbalist's Almanac of the Northern Reaches. It was a book she had only ever dreamed of seeing. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. "The glass garden is on the eastern side of the keep," he said. "No one will bother you there." He turned to leave, then paused. "Alina, my wife," he said, the word sounding rusty, unused. She loved the gardens, but she could not make anything grow. He walked away, leaving Civ standing in the doorway, clutching the book like a shield. He had given her a gift. He had shared a piece of his past, a small, painful memory. It was more intimate than any touch, more binding than any chain. He was slowly, carefully, building the walls of her cage higher, but he was also furnishing it with everything she had ever longed for. The glass garden was a miracle, a vast, domed structure of spun glass and iron nestled in a sheltered fold of the mountain. Inside, it was warm and humid, a riot of green in a world of gray stone. It was also utterly neglected. The flower beds were choked with weeds, the climbing roses running wild, their thorns snagging at the air. But the herbs were thriving. Lavender and rosemary, thyme and sage, their scents mingling in the warm air. It was a place of powerful, dormant life. It felt like coming home. Siv began to spend her days there. Hjordis, without being asked, supplied her with gloves, shears, and a small trowel. Siv worked for hours, her hands in the rich, dark earth, her mind blessedly quiet. She weeded and pruned, transplanted and nurtured. She found a patch of dying wolfsbane and, with a strange pang of recognition, sat with it, her hands hovering over the soil, willing it back to health. She was not always alone. Sometimes Pip would join her, chattering away as he helped, which mostly involved making mud pies. Other times, she would feel a presence and look up to see Bastian, the scarred captain, watching her from the entrance, his expression one of perpetual suspicion. He never spoke to her, but he was always there, a silent, hulking shadow. One afternoon, Valerius found her there. She was on her knees, her face smudged with dirt, carefully tending a patch of feverfew. He stood just inside the door, watching her. He was in his formal attire today, the silver wolf-head clasp of his office gleaming at his throat. He looked every inch the king. "Bastian returned from Greywood this morning," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the glass dome. Siv's hands went still in the dirt. She sat back on her heels but did not rise. "And?" "Your cousin Gisela has sold off your family's lands to the highest bidder. She has used the funds to secure a place at court for the winter season. She arrives in a week." He paused. "The official story is that she is in mourning for her beloved cousin and seeks the solace of the capital." A cold dread washed over Siv, chilling her despite the garden's warmth. Gisela, here, in Stonefall, where she could whisper her poison into the ears of the court, where she could see Siv alive and inexplicably favored by the king. "She will tell them I am mad," Siv said, her voice flat. "She will say you were bewitched by a cursed thing." "Let her," Valerius said. He walked toward her then, his boots silent on the stone path. He stopped a few feet away. "Your father's steward gave Bastian a message for you. He said to tell you that the northern birds have flown home." Siv looked up at him, her heart clenching. It was a code, a message she and the old steward had arranged. It meant that Hjordis, the housekeeper, was who she claimed to be, a distant relative of the steward, a friend to Siv's mother, a woman who could be trusted. It meant the old woman who had helped fake her death, who had guided her to the cottage in the Direwood, was not her true ally. It had been Hjordis all along, playing a long, dangerous game right under the king's nose. "Hjordis," Siv breathed. "She has served my house for 20 years, Valerius said, his eyes searching her face. "She was my mother's confidant, and Alina's, and she helped you deceive me." "She helped me survive," Siv corrected, finding her feet, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She knew what Gisela was. She knew what the auction meant for me. What would you have her do? Stand by and watch me be sold like livestock? No, he said, and the word was sharp, absolute. I would have her trust her king. Trust is earned, Siv shot back, her fear making her reckless. It is not a right of your crown. The air between them vibrated with tension. He was so close now. She could see the flecks of gray in his dark eyes, the faint lines of exhaustion etched at their corners. He looked at her dirt-smudged face and the defiant tilt of her chin, and something in his expression shifted. The anger, the royal pride, it all just fell away. You are right, he said, his voice quiet, rough with an emotion she couldn't name. It is. He looked around the garden, at the signs of new life, at the order she had brought to the chaos. Alina loved this place, he murmured, almost to himself. She would spend hours here. But everything she touched, it withered. She said the garden felt her sorrow and died of it. He looked back at Siv, his gaze intense. But for you, it grows. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of wonder, a recognition of the gift he did not understand. He saw her, not as a curse, not as a political problem, not as a broodmare, but as something other. Something that brought life to a place of death. He reached out, not to her, but to a wild rose that grew beside her. His fingers, long and calloused, brushed against a deep red petal. I have spent 6 years living in a tomb, Siv. I have filled my house with ghosts. He let his hand drop. Perhaps it is time I let in some light. He did not touch her. He did not need to. The words themselves were a touch, a crack in the granite wall of his grief. He was offering her something more than safety, more than a gilded cage. He was offering her a sliver of his broken soul. And Siv, who had spent her life soothing the broken, felt the irresistible, terrifying pull to reach out and make it whole. Gisela arrived with the first snow of winter, sweeping into the great hall of Stonefall like a storm of silk and ambition. She was beautiful in a sharp, predatory way, her blonde hair intricately braided with silver thread, her eyes the color of a frozen lake. She moved with the practiced grace of a woman who knew her own value and was determined to see it increased. Siv watched from the shadows of the upper gallery, Pip's small hand clutching hers. She had refused to attend the formal welcome, a small act of defiance Valerius had permitted with a silent nod. From her vantage point, she could see the entire court arrayed below, a sea of calculating faces. Gisela made her way directly to the throne where Valerius sat, as still and unmoving as the mountain itself. She sank into a deep, flawless curtsy. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice carrying through the hall, a perfect blend of respect and sorrow. "You honor me with your hospitality. I have come, as you know, seeking solace in my grief. The loss of my poor, dear cousin Siv has undone me." A murmur of sympathy rippled through the court. Siv felt Pip press closer to her side. "We are all undone by loss, Lady Gisela," Valerius said, his voice devoid of warmth. "Stonefall offers what solace it can." Gisela rose, her eyes sweeping the hall. I hear the strangest rumors, Your Majesty. Whispers of a ghost you brought back from the woods. A feral woman who has bewitched your court. Her gaze was sharp, probing. She was fishing, trying to gauge what the king knew, how secure her position was. My court is not so easily bewitched, Valerius replied, his tone dangerously mild. And I deal with the creatures of my woods myself. It was a dismissal, polite but absolute. But Gisela was not so easily deterred. Over the next few days, she was a constant poisonous presence. Siv would catch glimpses of her in the corridors, surrounded by a gaggle of sycophantic lords and ladies, her laughter sharp and brittle. The whispers followed in her wake. The king was enchanted. The strange woman was a witch. The royal child was in danger. Siv stayed in her rooms or in the sanctuary of her glass garden, but the fortress had begun to feel small, the walls closing in. The suspicion from the guards had returned, sharper now, fueled by Gisela's rumors. Only Hjordis remained a bastion of calm, her weathered face giving nothing away as she brought Siv's meals. The confrontation, when it came, was not of Gisela's making. It was Pip's. It happened during the midday meal in the great hall. Siv had finally been coaxed out of her seclusion by Pip, who had insisted she see the new puppies in the kennel. They were returning, hand in hand, cutting through the edge of the hall to avoid the main throng, when Gisela saw them. Siv? The name was a gasp of perfectly feigned shock and horror. The entire hall fell silent. Every head turned. Gisela rushed forward, her face a mask of distraught confusion. Siv! By the gods, it is you! What is this madness? We buried you. I mourned you. Siv froze, her blood turning to ice. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. You are alive? Gisela reached for her, her fingers like talons. But how? You were so sick, so lost in your delusions. We had to, for your own good. She turned to the assembled court, her eyes wide and filling with tears. My poor cousin. Her mind has always been fragile. She has these fantasies. She believes she speaks to animals, that she can steal their breath. She was painting the picture with masterful strokes. Siv, the mad woman, the cursed thing now let loose in the royal court. Siv stood, mute, caught in the glare of 100 hostile eyes. She could feel Pip trembling beside her. She is not for this world, Gisela continued, her voice choked with false sorrow. She belongs in a sanitarium, a place of quiet healing. Your Majesty, she pleaded, turning to Valerius, who had risen from his seat at the high table. You must let me take her home. I will care for her. It is my duty. The trap was laid. If Valerius refused, he was a cruel king holding a mad woman captive. If he agreed, he was delivering Siv back into the hands of her tormentor. Siv found her voice, a thin, reedy thing. I am not mad. Of course you're not, my love, Gisela soothed, reaching out to pat her arm. Of course not. The condescension was a slap in the face. And then a small, clear voice cut through the tension. She is not mad, Pip said. He stepped forward, placing himself between Siv and Gisela. He looked up at the beautiful, cruel woman, his small face set with a king's resolve. And you are a liar. Gisela stared down at the boy, momentarily speechless. "Siv makes the flowers grow," Pip announced to the silent hall. "And she makes the shadows go away. And my father says you are a viper." A collective gasp went through the room. Gisella's face, for the first time, lost its composure. A flash of pure, venomous fury crossed her features before she smoothed it away. "The poor child," she whispered, shaking her head sadly. "She has confused him, twisted him." But the damage was done. The court had seen the child's fierce loyalty. They had heard the king's own words for Gisella, spoken from the mouth of his son. Valerius began to walk down from the high table, his steps slow, deliberate, each one a hammer blow against the silence. He did not look at Gisella. He did not look at the court. His eyes were fixed on Siv and the small boy standing guard before her. He stopped in front of them, a mountain of quiet fury. He reached down, not for his son, but for Siv. His hand, warm and firm, closed around her wrist. "Lady Siv is under my protection," he said, his voice calm, but carrying to every corner of the hall. "She is a guest of this house. My guest." He paused, his gaze finally shifting to Gisella, and his eyes were chips of ice. "And you, Lady Gisella, have worn out your welcome. You will be gone by morning." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The authority in his words was absolute, unquestionable. He turned, still holding Siv's wrist, and began to lead her from the hall. Pip fell into step beside them, his small hand reaching up to clutch a fold of Siv's sleeve. The three of them walked out of the great hall together, leaving a stunned court and a ruined woman in their wake. They did not look back. They were a strange, broken little family, a dead woman, a grieving king, and a fading boy, and they had just declared war on the world. That night, Stonefall was quiet. The whispers had been silenced by the king's decree. Gisella was gone, escorted from the fortress before the sun had even set, her ambition finally undone. But the victory felt hollow, the silence heavy with unspoken things. Valerius sent for Siv, not to the great hall or some formal receiving room, but to the solar, his private study. It was a space of worn leather chairs, maps pinned to the walls, and a massive fireplace where a log fire burned, casting flickering shadows. He stood by the window, looking out at the snow falling softly in the darkness. "She will not trouble you again," he said without turning. "Her lands are forfeit to the crown. Her title stripped. She has nothing." Siv stood just inside the door, wrapping her arms around herself. The justice was swift, absolute, and it made her feel cold. "What will happen to her?" "She will live," he said. "That is more mercy than she showed you." He turned then, and his face was a landscape of grief. "I brought her to my court. I drank wine with her. I listened to her lies while you were living in a hovel, pretending to be dead. I failed you." "You didn't know," she whispered. "It is my business to know." The words were a raw cry of self-loathing, the first crack in his iron control. "I am the king, the alpha. I am supposed to protect the pack, all of it. Not just the strong, but the vulnerable, the ones who are cast out." He walked to the fireplace, resting his forehead against the cool stone of the mantelpiece. "For 6 years, I have done nothing but fail." Siv took a hesitant step into the room, then another. The pull she felt toward him, the strange resonance of her gift, was stronger than ever. It wasn't a sick wolf or a grieving child. It was the king himself, the most powerful man in the north, and he was breaking apart from the inside. "Tell me," she said softly, coming to stand a few feet behind him. "Tell me about her, about Alina." He was silent for so long, she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with unshed tears. "She was light," he said. "All laughter and sunshine. This fortress, this mountain, it crushed her. She was not made for the cold. After Pip was born, a sickness took root, a sadness. The healers called it a melancholy of the spirit. She just faded. She said the stones were stealing her breath." He turned to face her, his eyes haunted. "The day she died, we argued. I told her she had a duty, to her son, to her king. I told her to be stronger." His voice broke. "I demanded she fight, and she had no fight left. I walked out of her rooms. An hour later, she was gone. She threw herself from the window in the Queen's wing, the one you sleep by now." The confession fell into the silence of the room, a terrible, heavy thing. His guilt was not just grief. It was a certainty that he had killed his own mate with his coldness, with his demands. The wasting sickness wasn't a disease. It was a king who didn't know how to love something fragile without breaking it. Siv's heart ached for him, for the man who had carried this impossible burden alone for so long. She saw it all now. His hesitation to touch, his waiting for permission. He was terrified that his touch was poison, that his demands were a death sentence. She closed the distance between them. She did not speak. Words were useless here. She reached up, her hand trembling slightly, and laid her palm flat against his chest, over his heart. She could feel its frantic, unsteady rhythm beneath her hand. He flinched, a sharp, violent tremor, his eyes wide with a kind of primal fear. "Don't," he rasped. "I'll break you too." "No," she said, her voice a fierce, steady whisper. "You won't." She kept her hand there, a small, warm anchor in the storm of his grief. She felt it then, the core of his pain, a knot of ice and sorrow frozen for 6 long years. And her gift, the quiet, nameless thing inside her, began to warm it. Not to take it away, but to soothe it, to allow it, finally, to melt. A single tear tracked its way down his cheek, then another. He did not move. He did not make a sound. He just stood there, letting her hold the pieces of him. And slowly, so slowly, she felt the frantic beat of his heart begin to steady under her palm. He closed his eyes, and a long, shuddering breath escaped him, the first real breath he had taken in years. He did not pull her into his arms. He did not kiss her. He simply lifted his own hand and covered hers, pressing it more firmly against his chest. It was a gesture of acceptance, an acknowledgement. He was not healed, but he was no longer alone in his breaking. And in the quiet of the firelit room, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, Valerius, the Alpha King, finally began to let himself be saved. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. Winter held Stonefall in its icy grip, but inside the fortress a slow, tentative thaw was beginning. The Queen's wing was no longer a tomb. Siv had filled it with herbs from the glass garden, their clean, sharp scents chasing away the ghosts of lavender and sorrow. The shrouded furniture was uncovered, and Pip's toys were often scattered across the fine rugs. Siv's curse had become a quiet blessing. She spent time in the kennels, not just with Bracken, who was now healed, his limp a mere memory, but with all the wolves. The anxious, the old, the ill-tempered, they all seemed to settle in her presence. The kennel master, a gruff man who had initially viewed her with deep suspicion, now sought her out, asking her to sit with a new litter of pups that were failing to thrive. She brought life and calm to the forgotten corners of the fortress. Her relationship with Valerius was a thing of quiet spaces and unspoken understanding. He would find her in the garden, and they would work in comfortable silence, their hands in the same soil. He would join her and Pip by the fire in her sitting room, reading from a book of old histories, while his son sketched pictures on a slate. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping gestures. There was only this slow, careful building of a new reality. He still waited for permission, his movements around her always gentle, always offering her space. And she, in turn, learned to read the language of his stillness, the meaning in his silences. One evening, they were alone in the solar. Pip was asleep, the fortress was quiet, and the snow was falling thick and fast outside the window, muffling the world. Siv was mending one of Pip's tunics, her stitches small and even. Valerius was watching the fire, his profile limned in gold. "When the thaw comes," he said, his voice low, "the lords of the north will gather. They will expect me to announce a new mate, to secure the line." Siv's needle stilled. The comfortable peace of the room evaporated. The world was pressing in again. "There are many suitable ladies at court," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Daughters of powerful houses." "I am not interested in a powerful house," he said, turning to look at her. The firelight played in his dark eyes, making them seem deep and fathomless. "I am interested in a woman who can make things grow in a wasteland. A woman who is not afraid of shadows. A woman who stood between my son and a viper." He rose from his chair and came to her. He did not loom over her. Instead, he knelt before her, so their eyes were on a level. It was the posture of a supplicant, not a king. It was the most vulnerable she had ever seen him. "I am asking you, Siv," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not as your king, but as a man. Not for my line, but for my son, for myself." He reached out and took her hand, the one not holding the needle. His touch was warm, no longer tinged with that deep internal cold. "Be my mate. Be my queen. Build a life with me here, not in a cage, but in a home." He waited. His heart was in his eyes, his hope a fragile, flickering thing. He was giving her the choice he had stolen from his first wife. He was offering her a crown, but more than that, he was offering her his broken, healing heart. Siv looked at their joined hands, at the calluses on his fingers from sword and rain, and the faint dirt under her own nails from the garden. They were a king and a nobody, a warrior and a healer. They were two lonely, broken people who had found a way to be whole together. "Yes," she whispered. The word was small, but it filled the entire room. "Yes, Valerius." A slow smile spread across his face, a real smile, one that reached his eyes and transformed his severe features into something achingly beautiful. He did not crush her in an embrace. He simply lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Then he rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the quiet air. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the old world in a blanket of clean, white silence. And inside the heart of the mountain, spring had finally begun. 3 years passed. The snows came and went, and the glass garden bloomed with a ferocity that defied the northern climate. Stonefall was no longer a place of granite and grief. Its stone corridors now echoed with the patter of small feet and the occasional burst of childish laughter. Flowers from the garden graced the tables in the great hall, and the scent of baking bread often wafted from the kitchens, signs of Yordis's quiet, joyful reign. Siv stood on the battlements, a soft breeze teasing the loose strands of her auburn hair. It was late summer, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. Below, in the training yard, Valerius was sparring with a now 9-year-old Pip. The boy was no longer fragile. He was lean and strong, his movements quick and sure as he parried his father's carefully controlled blows. His laughter rang out, clear and healthy. Valerius looked up, as if sensing her gaze, and his eyes met hers across the distance. The smile he gave her was one of easy, contented love. It was a language they had perfected over the years, a conversation held in glances and quiet moments. He was no longer a king haunted by ghosts. He was a husband and a father. His strength now a source of safety, not severity. A small tug on her skirt drew Siv's attention. She looked down into a pair of serious, dark eyes set in a round, determined face. Her daughter, Alina, named for a memory that no longer held pain, but a gentle sorrow. The 2-year-old held up a slightly squashed wildflower. "For you," the little girl stated, her voice a miniature version of her father's decisiveness. "For me?" Siv knelt down, accepting the small, crumpled offering as if it were a crown jewel. "Thank you, my love. It's beautiful." Alina patted her mother's cheek, her small hands surprisingly gentle. "Sad," she said, pointing toward the kennels. Siv followed her gaze. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel it, a faint tremor of distress. Her gift had not faded. It had simply settled, becoming a part of the fabric of her life. "Is one of the hounds unwell?" "Bracken," Alina said with certainty. Siv smiled. Her daughter had inherited a sliver of the gift, a faint echo of the same quiet resonance. She scooped the little girl into her arms. "Well then, I suppose we should go and see an old friend, shouldn't we?" She walked toward the stairs that led down to the kennels, her daughter's warm weight a comfortable presence in her arms. As they passed the doorway to the royal wing, Yordis emerged, her face softened by age and contentment. She winked at Alina. "Off to solve the problems of the world, are we, little queen?" "Bracken is sad," Alina informed her gravely. "Well, he won't be for long," Yordis said, her fond gaze resting on Siv. In the kennels, they found the old wolf lying in a patch of sun, his great black head on his paws. He was not sick or injured. He was just old, and his dreams were troubled. He lifted his head as Siv approached, his tail giving a single, slow thump against the stone floor. Siv sat down beside him, settling Alina on her lap. She didn't speak. She just rested her hand on the wolf's broad, grizzled head, her fingers stroking the familiar, coarse fur. Alina mimicked the gesture, her tiny hand patting Bracken's nose. The old wolf sighed, a deep, contented sound, and the tension in his frame eased. He closed his eyes, leaning into their touch. A shadow fell over them. Valerius stood there, his sparring leathers dusty, his face relaxed. Pip was at his side, leaning against his father's leg. "Fixing the world again?" Valerius asked, his voice soft. "Just sitting with a friend," Siv replied, looking up at him. He knelt beside her, completing their circle. He, Siv, their 2 children, and the old wolf who had, in a way, started it all. He didn't say anything. He just rested his hand on the back of her neck, his thumb stroking her skin in a familiar, comforting rhythm. It was all here, everything that mattered. Not a grand kingdom, but this small, fiercely protected circle of love, a fated refuge built not on power or prophecy, but on the quiet, stubborn work of healing. The life she had once thought impossible, a fragile thing of moss and mist, had taken root in stone and had grown into something strong enough to last forever.